of you who don't know me, my name is Ray Cashman. I direct the Folklore Institute. More importantly, it is my pleasure tonight to welcome you to Professor Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett's presentation, Choreography of a Career, a Folklorist's Evolving Perspective on Folklore, Heritage, and Museums. This serves as the 2020 Dorson Memorial Lecture, hosted by the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, and also thanks to additional support from the Institute for Advanced Study. This is concurrently serving as a Herman B. Wells Lecture. Now, I'll have more people to thank toward the end for their help and their sponsorship, but for now, let me start with a quick word about the nature of the Dorson Lecture. It's named in honor and in memory of Richard Mercer Dorson, director of the Indiana University Folklore Institute, established in 1956, and later he was the first chair of the IU Folklore Department. Now, this annual lecture allows us to invite to Bloomington an exemplary scholar in the field of folklore studies, someone from outside campus, and it really is the highlight of our yearly programming. This year we are particularly excited and honored to have with us a world-famous alumna who earned her PhD in folklore here at IU in 1972, having taken classes with Richard Dorson, having fought and bled at IU and at UT Austin with a number of familiar faces in the crowd here tonight. Here's the thing. A proper introduction to all of Barbara's works and miracles would really cut into her time. So I'm just going to stick to kind of the basics here. But you should know some things, including, well, Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett is University Professor Emerita and Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University. She is also the curator responsible for the core exhibition, that is a multimedia narrative experience at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Barbara has served as the president of the American Folklore Society and the AFS delegate to the American Council of Learned Science Societies. She is a folklore fellow of the Finnish Academy of Sciences and Letters. She is the recipient of many awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, grants for the American Council of Learned Societies, National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities. She received the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A leading scholar in folklore studies, but also in performance studies more broadly, anthropology, museum studies, Jewish studies. Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett's books include Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, Image Before My Eyes, A Photographic History of Jewish Life in Poland, 1864 to 1939. They Call Me Meyer July, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust with Meyer Kirshenblatt. She's also, of course, author of several edited volumes and countless pioneering and perspicacious articles and chapters. Now, tonight, Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett will reflect on her formative years in folklore studies, which are also some of the most formative years in the field as a whole, sketching for us her trajectory to current thinking about tangible and intangible cultural heritage, exhibition, and museums. Now, before I hand over the floor, let me be quick to thank the Institute for Advanced Study, the Born's Jewish Studies Program, the Russian and East European Institute, and the Polish Studies Center for sponsorship of additional events while Barbara is here with us. With those in mind, note that tomorrow, 7 o'clock, there will be a screening of Raise the Roof, including a Q&A with Barbara. This film focuses on the contemporary construction of an elaborate wooden synagogue along traditional 18th century models today in Warsaw after the destruction of all precursors during World War II. Now, that film will be in the Wells Library Viewing Room 048. Again, that's at 7 o'clock. Also tomorrow, Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett has graciously offered to meet with folklore and ethnomusicology graduate students. That's from 2:30 to 4 in the department, room 102. Note also that interested students from other sister disciplines and departments are also very welcome. There will be pizza. For those of you who don't know, our department is at 800 East 3rd Street. It's just to the south of 3rd Street and a little bit to the east from here. Not a far walk. But that reminds me, we're also having a reception at that very place tonight after the lecture in question, so please do join us for some food and some conversation there. Again, 800 East 3rd Street. If you don't know, follow the crowd. Anyway, without further ado, enough of me. Help me in welcoming back to Bloomington, Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.
Much, Ray, for the kind invitation. I want to thank especially Elliot Oring and Bill Ivey, who inaugurated and have been supporting the Dorson Memorial Lecture, and I am honored and thrilled to have been invited to deliver the lecture. In thinking about what I would speak about, I proposed a whole range of topics, things I've worked on, all kinds of interesting topics, and then it struck me that ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies, has a really wonderful tradition, and that is they invite each year for their annual meeting a scholar who delivers a lecture under the heading A Life of Learning. And I thought, you know, I can't think of anywhere else except here where my life of learning would be so appropriate, because I would be speaking to my own cohort. So many of those who were graduate students with me when I was here between 1967 and 1970, which is half a century ago, 50 years ago. Many of those people are here. And so and we used to argue all the time, and I would expect that that will continue this evening. So I'm counting, Elliot, I'm counting on you.
I disagree.
See, we're off to a good start. Okay. So, what I'd like to do this evening is basically to draw out some threads, because these threads they start from different points, they go in different directions, and then they all actually come together and culminate in the project that has consumed me for the last 15 years. And so, if you'll be patient in a sense, waiting to see how they all come together, I think it'll become clear. So let me start with my family. I am the child of Polish Jews. I am an immigrant, and I am the child of immigrants. My father was born in 1916 in Opatów, which is a town before the war, a town of 10,000 people in south-central Poland, the Second Polish Republic. And when he was 17, his family, that is, his father came earlier, but his mother and his three brothers immigrated to Canada and settled in Toronto. And he would have been 17 in 1934. My mother was 14 and when she left Poland, and she grew up actually in a city, in Brest-Litovsk, or Brest nad Bugiem. This is a city where the World War I treaty was signed. And she led a more sheltered life, and as a result, her memories are very, very different from my father's, and you'll see in a moment why that's important. Now, the Toronto they settled in my mother in 1928, my father in 1934, was, I would say, very much like the Lower East Side was before World War I, or even in the teens. It was a vibrant immigrant neighborhood. It was very diverse, a very Jewish neighborhood. And those of you, there is somebody in this room who does know Yiddish. There may be more than one person who will appreciate the Yiddish, because you read the English and I'll read the Yiddish. Milk, store, cream, cheese, butter, und eggs, fish. So that you can see that all of you can understand Yiddish. So this was a vibrant Jewish neighborhood. Yiddish was spoken on the street. There was a lively Yiddish theater, lots of Jewish restaurants. And that would be the story, really, of the 20s, the 30s, even the 40s. I was born in 1942, so I was born during the war, and I grew up in the late 40s, the 1950s, in downtown Toronto. And this is pretty much what downtown Toronto would have looked like in the Jewish neighborhood, with the Kensington Market. Any of you who have visited Toronto will know that it's still a really wonderful, vibrant place, though has transitioned from being a Jewish market to being more Portuguese. The neighborhood has become much more of a Chinese area. But this gives you a little bit of a feel of the neighborhood. And I remember, believe it or not, growing up in the 50s, that we still had a milk truck that was brought by a horse and delivered milk, and those bottles, which had like a narrow neck, so the cream was on the top. Did anybody experience that in their childhood? Okay, but I mean, really in the 50s, a horse-drawn wagon with milk? I mean, it boggles the mind when I think about it now. And there was also a vegetable truck that came around, and a knife sharpener. So, I mean, this was the 50s in Toronto. So the street that I grew up on, Cecil Street, in this downtown Jewish neighborhood, consisted of these kind of row houses, and this was such an intensely Jewish neighborhood that on the ground level, there were, almost, I mean, I can't tell you how many up and down the street were what we call shtiblach. In other words, prayer rooms for small Jewish congregations. Some of them Hasidic, some of them not. And the street was anchored at either end by two big synagogues named for the town of those Jews who had established the congregation in that building. And right across the road from me was the Verbandschule, a Yiddish laborers, actually from the Jewish labor movement, had their own school. There was a Peretschule, which is a secular Yiddish school. None of them were any good. And across the road was the Jewish Home for the Aged. And since none of the schools were any good, they sent me to what was considered to be a modern Talmud Torah, which was an Orthodox religious school. And the only thing modern about it was that boys and girls were in the same room. Otherwise, corporal punishment. I still had nightmares about that school. So that was my, if you will, after-school Jewish education. And what that really is a way of signaling is growing up in a neighborhood that was an intensely immigrant neighborhood, and in the late 1940s, but mainly in the 50s, it was also the place where Holocaust survivors who had arrived in Toronto, this was the area where they came and where they were helped in an organization called the Volksverein, which really basically helped to place them and help them to get started and create a new life. And I played with their kids on the street in Yiddish. So this is kind of a starting point, because as I think you will see as we move through this career, in a way, I kind of ended up where I started, and that's why I wanted to really set out the starting point. And then my parents in their wisdom, my mother especially, was worried that when I was about 12 or 13, and I would start dating sometime after that, hopefully, that this was not a good neighborhood for a girl to be dating, and they moved to the suburbs. And so I spent my teenage years, in fact, in the northern part of the city, in the suburbs, which I considered the most boring place on earth. And of course, as soon as I was able to, I left the suburbs and moved right back downtown to where I had spent my childhood. A second, very, very important piece of my story had to do with being, my family was a Zionist family, and I belonged to a Zionist youth group, Habonim. I spent many summers at a Zionist summer camp on Lake Erie, Camp Kfutza, that had 0 facilities, no horses, and in fact there was a point at which there was no electricity, and if you wanted to dance you had to sing. We were on a lake, on Lake Erie, which means there's such big waves that you can hardly swim. But it was an incredible experience, and it turned out to be an absolutely critical one in terms of where I finally went with my career. And so that would be sort of the, if you will, the Jewish piece. But I also grew up during the folk song revival, which was really, really important. And went to not Carnegie Hall, but to the equivalent of Carnegie Hall in Toronto for the Weavers, Peter, Paul and Mary, Pete Seeger. And so the folk song revival, and I would say that, basically I would say that I actually lived through two countercultural movements. The first was the black turtleneck, that was the beatniks, and the second were the rainbow colors, that was the hippie movement. So kind of moved through two of them, and especially, though I think important, was the folk song revival. Growing up in Toronto, my idea of the ultimate place to get my undergraduate education and degree was the University of Toronto. And so I began there after a year in Israel, and it was during my first year at the University of Toronto that I met the man that I would marry and to whom I have been married for 55 years. And it is thanks to him, because he was a ceramist, he was a potter at the time, and became a painter. It was thanks to him that we moved to San Francisco, because he decided when the Ontario Art College would not admit him at the age of 27, because he didn't have a high school diploma, he decided he would go to the San Francisco Art Institute, and I applied to the University of California, Berkeley. And I asked my advisors at the University of Toronto, I said, did they think it would be a big come down from the University of Toronto? And they said, you'll be fine. And I was. So if not for Max, if he had not, because his mother pulled him out of school when he was 15, and he put him to work in a factory, if not for Max, we would not have gone to San Francisco. If we'd not gone to San Francisco, I would not have gone to the University of California. Well, I was completely disoriented in the first year, and I couldn't figure out why, and I was told it was culture shock. Because, of course, this is the period of the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement. It was just everything, and it was an extraordinary, extraordinary time to be at the University of California. And when I got to the University of California, you have to understand the Canadian school system, in their wisdom, 5 years of high school, 4 wasn't enough, had to have a 5th year. And honors English major at the University of Toronto, and I'd finished 3 years. So I had to finish my BA at the University of California, Berkeley. And when I got there, I was told that I had more credits in English literature than I needed for their masters. But they said, what happened to your breadth requirements? I said, breadth? University of Toronto, there was no such thing as breadth. You did, a whole year of Anglo-Saxon language. Can you imagine? You wouldn't imagine there was so much language that it would take a whole year. A whole year of Anglo-Saxon literature. I mean, how much Anglo-Saxon literature is there? It was a dream of the rude, honestly. And it was a whole year of Chaucer and a whole year of Shakespeare. I think it was a semester of American literature, nothing on Canadian literature. So, it was wall to wall. English literature, French literature, art history, history of architecture, philosophy, aesthetics. That was pretty much the curriculum. So they said, well, you have to take freshman physics.
Oh God.
Okay. Freshman physics, 500 people in a class. You can well imagine what that was like. And they said, and you've got to fulfill social science requirements. Oh, I opened up the catalog. It was like a kid in a candy shop. I thought, oh my God. And then I saw folklore. Really? I couldn't believe it, because folk song revival, I was interested in craft and material culture and weaving, and I did all that kind of stuff myself. I spent a whole summer in my parents' basement learning 40 cat's cradles from the appendix to McElraith's book on the Northwest Coast Indians, and I figured that was definitely a credential for this course. And I had read as a kid, I'd read all the Andrew Lang fairy tale books, the red, the yellow, the gold, the green. So I give a look and I see that I have to go meet the professor because I have to get permission to get in the course. So I go and I meet the professor. That desk is nothing. Any of you who ever visited Alan Dundas in his home and walked into his study? Did anybody ever who saw his study? His study, it was like the Red Cross had just evacuated. His study was that desk multiplied 100 times in the middle of the floor, a mountain of paper. I don't know how he navigated around the edges of it to get to a desk of some kind. So I go to see him, and he's, that's exactly, he'd be sitting there like this, and I tell him my qualifications, I tell him about the cat's cradles, I tell him about Andrew Lang, and he listens, and he is like a spider in a web, and I was the fly that he caught. So I enrolled immediately in his introduction to folklore. Now this was in 1965, and he had come to Berkeley in 1963, so he was really, and he come from, I think, from the University of Kansas. So he was very fresh, and he was at a very, very interesting, I think, place in terms of his own work, and that was structuralism, which was absolutely, really, it was revelatory. I mean, later on, his work moved more in a Freudian direction, but at this time, I really thought he was really at the top of his game. He was an absolutely brilliant, charismatic teacher. His style of teaching was crowdsourcing, basically. What he would do in the class would be that he would basically elicit from the class proverbs, riddles, nicknames, you name it, and then he would work with that material, and he could take a class, and he would have easily a class of 100, 150 people, and he would be able to somehow or other generate the material from the class and then work with it. Now, what I remember, because I think this is, because basically I got to either study or teach at each of the major folklore programs in the country at the time, and at the time when they were at their peak. So it's a very, very special, I mean, I feel that my own career path and the history of the field, as Ray said, they really, really converged. So what was the assignment for the Intro to Folklore class? It was collect 100 items of folklore. You know, I mean, we would never make that kind of an assignment today. It's out of the question. That's not how we would. It's not how we would teach it. And of course, he had file cabinets, you know, full. I mean, you weren't a folklore program if you didn't have an archive, and the archive had in it all the stuff that students had collected. So you had to collect it, and you had to have the person's name and their age and the date and some information. But that was basically the assignment for the course. And he was one of the major, I would say, discipline builders, but without building a program or a department. Well, program somewhat, but without building a department. He was basically a one-man show. And he held the fort, really, and he literally died during a graduate seminar, teaching. He died teaching. Absolutely extraordinary. And so when we think about foundational figures who actually were committed to shaping, forming folklore as a discipline, as a field, how do you do it? Well, apart from teaching and having heirs, it was to actually create textbooks. And I think the study of folklore, this edited volume, I think it's one of the first, if not the first, but it certainly came out during the time that I was at Berkeley. And so at Berkeley, once I had the freedom to do breadth requirements, basically I did a folklore curriculum. So I went through the masters, and I basically did folklore because I didn't need to do English literature. I had basically done it, really done it. And so I studied with Dundas, but I also studied with Bertrand Bronson. I took his 2-semester course on the English and Scottish popular ballad. The first semester was in his office. There were about maybe 10 of us. And the second semester was at his home around the dining room table with his collection of vinyls. Now, he was a very distinguished gentleman. He was a specialist in 18th century English literature, a very, kind of an elegant kind of subject. And then he would play these country western, these cowboys singing, and he would just go into sort of a bliss mode, because of course his great contribution was to find the tunes for the ballads, because Child only provided the texts. So, during my MA year, I went to him, and I asked him for a recommendation, and he said he wouldn't give me one. And I said, but I got an A in both courses. I said, why? He said, you want to do a PhD in folklore? He said, that's professional suicide. He said, look at me. I have a PhD in English literature. I work on folklore. It's not a real field. You need to get a PhD in a real field. So I never got a recommendation from Bronson, but I of course got a recommendation from Alan. And Alan, I think, really is to be commended, because he was a mentor for me long after I graduated, long after I got my PhD. There wouldn't be an AFS meeting where we wouldn't have a conversation. He would ask me what I'm doing, and he would give me advice, and he would be tracking and following my career, and he would be incredibly, incredibly supportive. So this is how I began in folklore. And so I got ready to leave San Francisco, and all of my friends said, "What? You're going to leave San Francisco and you're going to Bloomington?" They couldn't believe it. And I said, well, it's the best folklore program in the country. That's what I want to do. I want to do a PhD in folklore. And then we came to Bloomington, and in fact, we had 3 wonderful years in Bloomington between 1967 and 1970. It was my first garden, our first dog, but most of all, what was wonderful about it were my fellow students. And many of them, many of my peers are here in the room. They've either stayed in Bloomington or come back to Bloomington. And it was, in a sense, it was the world that we created together and for each other that was so precious and so memorable and so valuable that it was the making. And I would say then, Bloomington was much smaller than it is now. In a sense, all we had was each other. It was the only game in town. And it was really, and we have many, many stories, but I will save them for over a beer or a glass of wine or something else. So Alan Dundas, in his own way, was a discipline builder, and Dorson was absolutely a discipline builder, and his method was to actually build the department, and not just a program, courses, and students, but to build the department, but also to do what Dundas had done, which is to create textbooks. So this Folklore and Folklife, an introduction, and there are many, many other books, and also his Folktales of the World series, plus his own books. He really came out of American studies. He was very much of American studies and very much coming out of a historian, I would say American history as well. He was my advisor, he was my dissertation advisor, and, but I would say that his impact on me intellectually was less and less consequential than some other faculty here and elsewhere. So what was the first transformative moment? In my first semester, fall of 1967, I took Jerry Mintz's field research course, Field Research Methods. Elliot recalls taking it as well, and being a contrarian, beloved contrarian that he is, he apparently asked, if I may repeat it, he apparently asked Professor Mintz, if we have an archive full of material, shouldn't we look at that material first before we do field work? And after that, Elliot was a persona non grata. So like, finished. So what happened? Jerry Mintz had done his dissertation on Legends of the Hasidim, and this was working with the community in Brooklyn. And I don't know how it happened, but in the course of the course, he discovered that I knew Yiddish. So he said, well, why don't you do something, on Yiddish folklore? Which honestly had never ever occurred to me. I mean, it's, I came from a world that was sort of absolutely rich in Yiddish, but it had never occurred to me at all. If anything, I had wanted to study Chinese instead of French, but I was told it had nothing to do with English literature, so it wasn't allowed. So that was the first thing. So I had to do a project on Yiddish folklore for the fieldwork class. But in that semester, I was also taking Russian folklore with Felix Oines. And Felix was actually, he Estonian, he worked on Estonian material, and we used the only textbook there was, which was by Sokolov, Soviet-era Russian folklore book. And that Thanksgiving, I went home with the Russian folklore book because I had an assignment, I had to read from it, and I'm reading from the chapter on death. I read from the chapter on death, and I'm sitting at the kitchen table, my mother's washing the dishes, my father's reading the newspaper, and I start to read from the chapter on death. And it says something like this. It says, when the person dies, you lay out the corpse, and you put the feet towards the door so the dead person won't find their way back in, and you open the window, and you put a glass of water by the window and a little hanky so that the soul can wash itself as it exits and can dry itself off. And and my father says, well, we did that, or we did something like that. I said, really? What else did you do? And thus began a recorded conversation of more than 40 years. So what happened was that so the conversation began to fulfill Jerry Mintz's course requirement for fieldwork methods. And I basically collected material from my father, from my mother. They really were very, very different. From my mother was a kind of, I would say, a folk psychologist. She just had great emotional intelligence. And she had learned from her mother a wonderful repertoire of proverbs and parables. And so her use of social metaphor to help to soften or resolve conflict situations, just everyday life, was astonishing. So that was really what I worked on from my mother. And from my father, he just had this incredible memory. And initially, it was to fulfill this course requirement. However, this was a period in the history of the field, especially in Indiana, when there was, I would say, it's the 60s. So this is the period of these sort of ethnic identity, where there was a lot of interest in different ethnic groups. And at IU, here, there were a lot of dissertations. It was, whether it was Barbara Klein working on Swedes, it was Robert Klimash working on Ukrainians, and you had dissertations that were essentially the folklore of immigrant groups in North America or in the United States. And I know, it was called the new ethnicity. That's it. It was the new ethnicity. It was a very 1960s kind of thing. And there were dissertations on these various immigrant groups, and the idea was, what did they bring with them from Europe? What did they preserve? How did they change their traditions? That was the idea, and it was immigrant group by immigrant group by immigrant group. Klimash, he got a job at the Canadian Centre for Folk Culture Studies at what was then called the National Museum of Man in Ottawa, and then became the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and now it's a museum, they're calling it history. They have a problem with civilization.
Yeah.
So he continued to work on Ukrainian folklore, but I found out that he was commissioning surveys in Canada of the folklore of different immigrant groups. So I contacted him and I said, listen, would you like a survey of Yiddish folklore in Toronto? He said, sure. So he then sent me a U-hair recorder. I mean, I have like 7-inch reels in a wooden box that I was to use for making my survey. When I got this contract, I immediately contacted Michael Herzog, who had been the director of Camp Futsa, where I had gone as a kid, and where I had, it's just the confluence is, when I think about it, I just can't believe it. So Michal was a linguist, had studied with Uriel Weinreich, who was a wonderful, wonderful linguist, and he wrote his dissertation on the Yiddish language in northern Poland. It was a study of basically of Yiddish dialectology. And he was actually working on it when he was director of the summer camp. The summer camp was a labor Zionist summer camp, which means that while it was Zionist, it promoted the Yiddish language, because usually you would think if it's Zionist, it would be Hebrew. But no, it definitely, the labor Zionist movement definitely celebrated Yiddish. So I called him up. He was in New York teaching at Columbia, and I said, you'll never guess, I'm going to do a survey of Yiddish folklore in Toronto for the Canadian National Museum in Ottawa. He said, I'm sending you a ticket to New York, an airplane ticket to New York, and I want you here in 2 weeks. So I had absolutely no idea what he had in mind. So I got on a plane and I went to New York, and he took me to the Vanderbilt Mansion on 86th Street and 5th Avenue. And at this mansion, he basically, this was the home to the Evo Institute for Jewish Research, which was established in Vilna, today Vilnius, in 1925, and was a kind of university for a people without a state. And it was dedicated to the study of all aspects of East European Jewish life, and especially to cultural creativity in the Yiddish language, and an affirmation of the culture that Jews created in the diaspora, that is to say, as a co-territorial population. And he took me there and he introduced me to the luminaries of the field, to Chaim Lotek and Bina Weinreich, to people who were just, basically what I discovered was that there was a whole universe of high quality scholarship in the Yiddish language that I had absolutely no idea about. He took me into the basement, into the archive. He took me into the vault. They had a vault. And in this vault, they actually had recordings of Sholem Aleichem reading his own work and manuscripts. He took me to visit Max Weinreich, who was one of the founders of YIVO, who just shortly before he died. I was just simply absolutely blown away. So, basically, what I discovered was that from Evo's perspective, a whole generation of folklorists, people who studied folk song, did ethnography, had perished in the Holocaust. And that when Evo moved its headquarters to New York in 1939, which was September 1st is when the Germans invaded Poland, that in the immediate post-war years, they were desperate to create a new generation that would somehow or other bridge this chasm that had been created by the Holocaust. And so when a young person turned up, somebody getting a PhD, who was working on Yiddish folklore, this was, this meant the world, because many of the people at Evo at that time were themselves Holocaust survivors. So it was, I felt, an enormous responsibility, an enormous, I would say, mission to somehow rather be a kind of link or kind of continuity for, for this intellectual tradition. So I came back to Indiana University. I came back to the folklore department. There's no Jewish studies. Elliot and I were the only ones working on Jewish material. There was no Jewish studies. All there was our beloved Henry Fischel. Henry was a Talmudist, the first book of the Maccabees, and other Near Eastern topics, Talmud. And I had to take his Talmud course, and let me tell you, that was not easy. But he was wonderful, and he said that he would advise us. Elliot, meanwhile, is working on humor in Israel. I'm working on Yiddish folklore, and Professor Fischel's working on the Maccabees. So but he was very patient. So I think we did a PhD exam in Jewish folklore, and he basically oversaw it. He served on our committees. He was absolutely wonderful. And he is one of the founders of Jewish studies here at IU. Since then, and Jewish studies now is a very serious enterprise here. And he was born and raised in Germany, and he was a Holocaust survivor himself. But I would say that from an intellectual point of view, where intellectually, where I really, how can I say, basically, IU at the time, yes, there was folklore in context. Yes, we were doing more than sort of collecting items, but the transformative moment came when Kenny Goldstein came in the summers and brought with us the wisdom from the University of Pennsylvania. And what did he bring? Something new was happening. It was called ethnography of communication, sociolinguistics. Now, to be fair, here I had studied with, of course, with Tom Sebiok, had studied semiotics, structuralism, which was definitely, how can I say, in other words, we had cut our teeth on the motif index, the tail type index, the historic geographic method, and I actually love that stuff. In fact, to this day, I have almost like a shrine of the motif index on my shelf, and the Arne Thompson type index. Not that I have opened either of them, used them in recent memory, but I have a kind of affection for them. And today, we had a session in Sully's class in the library, and I met Steph Thompson. There he is, because he was alive when I was here, and every so often he would be brought out of, I would say, well, retirement is maybe, I'm not quite sure, but he would be presented to us, and Steph Thompson. So I do have an affection for my early training in tail types and motif index and historic geographic method. But then when encountering semiotics and structuralism, that was a kind of a bridge that brought us to what I would consider really a performance approach, sociolinguistics, ethnography of communication, and the like. And it was Kenny who really brought that. So that movement from, I would say, if you will, folklore items in context, looking at them from a kind of generative, structuralist, and then semiotic point of view, and then coming at it from sociolinguistic, ethnographic, ethnography of speaking point of view, that is a huge trajectory, and it actually is, I think it was revelatory for us, and Irving Goffman, Labov, Himes, and others. It was revelatory for us at IU, and it came to us in the summer, when Kenny came and really brought us these treasures from University of Pennsylvania. So, while I was in my graduate work here, I had, of course, collected all this material and decided then I would actually write my dissertation, which was storytelling in the Toronto Jewish community. I think a study of cultural creativity in an immigrant community, something along those lines. And it was absolutely shaped by the experience of what Kenny had brought to us in the summer. And one of the chapters was a development of a paper that I gave. It was my very, very, very first paper at AFS. And it was an analysis of a parable that my mother told. The paper's called A Parable in Context. I'm sure many of you know it. And of course, I was so nervous. It was my first paper at AFS, and I was just nervous beyond words that I polished it like a diamond. It was just a little gem. And I had prepared a kind of an outline, so God forbid somebody didn't exactly get it. The whole thing was diagrammed and handouts, and it was... So, who was in the audience? Roger Abrams, Dick Bauman. Now, they were like, attached at the hip. So, they said, the two of them said, let's go have a cup of coffee. And you might remember it differently than I remember it, but I remember very vividly. We were sitting in a booth, if I remember correctly, and we had our cup of coffee, and they offered me a job at the University of Texas.
Wow.
It was my first academic tenure track appointment. So I thought, whoa, that is amazing. So we packed up all our stuff, and we put it in a U-Haul, and we attached our old car behind it, and we drove to Texas. I had absolutely no idea what to expect. And Austin in 1970, because we were in Texas 1970 to 72, Austin in 1970 was a really sleepy state capital. Nothing like it is today. But it was wonderful. Barton Springs and the split rail and the Salt Lick, but mainly people. America Paredes was there, having as my colleagues Roger and Dick. You could not have asked for better. And as a result, that whole strand, that whole direction, the direction of a kind of performance approach to speech and to cultural practices, it evolved, developed, and deepened from my exposure, my relationship, my contact with these two wonderful, wonderful colleagues. At the end of it, now, my husband Max, the holy grail for him was New York. And the question was how to get there. So he thought, well, I went to San Francisco for him, he'll come to Bloomington for me, and then we'll go to New York. I said, no, we have to go to Texas first. So he said, okay, but we have to get to New York. So what happened was that I kept my contact up with Evo, and I applied for a grant to do a major project on the Yiddish folk song. And we got the funding, and it allowed me to I can't remember, I don't think it was a leave of absence, but it allowed us to go to New York, and we arrived in New York in 1972. And if you know anything about the 1970s in New York, you know the city was on the verge of bankruptcy.
Yes.
So it was, and we found a place to live on the Bowery, and we lived there for 44 years, and only in the last, not even quite a year, in May it'll be a year, we moved around the corner. But that Yiddish folk song project was an extraordinary project because it was the first time that the Yiddish folk song had been studied from, I would say, a performance point of view. That is, not only did I record, first of all, it was not only myself, but I formed a team, and I also taught a series of seminars at the Max Weinrock Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at Evo, where I actually organized the whole seminar as a research project, and each student was either assigned or found a traditional singer, and their task was to record the entire repertoire. It didn't matter whether it was popular or folk or in English or in Yiddish or in Ukrainian or Russian or Polish. It didn't matter whether it was a macronic song in multiple languages, but they had to record the entire repertoire, and then I developed a very extensive questionnaire that would really get at every conceivable aspect of the song and the singer's relationship to the song. And that is an extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary collection of material that's now at Evo is being digitized. And it was, at the time, really considered to be a groundbreaking project. And that was the last generation of those traditional singers. After that, and I have to say that I was very, very deeply moved to discover that Dick Bauman's grandmother was one of the singers for one of the first important collections of Yiddish folk song, and which is just extraordinary, and that's something that's always been very, very dear to my heart. So that project allowed us to come to New York. And once we were in New York, and once I was at Evo, there was the Yiddish folk song project, but there was also another project. And the other project was to work with Lucien Dobrzycki, a wonderful historian, a survivor of the Lodz Ghetto, who in 1968 was forced to leave Poland because of a government-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign. And he arrived in New York with no English, no job, nothing, and Evo hired him and gave him an assignment to catalog approximately 15,000 photographs in their collection, photographs that have been taken between 1864 and 1939, and my task was to work with him to create an exhibition, a book, and the basis for a film. And that was an extraordinary experience, and it was the first major museum project that I actually undertook. And the result was, as Ray had mentioned, the result was image before my eyes. So here I am in New York, and I'm at Evo, and we have the Yiddish Folk Song Project, and we have this photography project. Beautiful exhibition opened at the Jewish Museum. We showed about 500 of the original photographs, and it was groundbreaking in itself because it worked against the stereotype that East European Jews were basically poor, pious, and persecuted. It showed a much broader range of Jewish life, and it really took issue with the ways in which, I would say, well, with the image that, if you know the work of Roman Vishniak, then you will know something of the ways in which photography had been used to represent this world, and this really broke with that completely. But in order to stay on the East Coast and stay in New York, I needed really to find a way, and fortunately, I was hired at the University of Pennsylvania. So here I was, I had my beginnings with Dundas and the University of California, Berkeley. I had done my PhD at Indiana here in a very sort of a golden period of the field. And now, at the University of Pennsylvania, I thought I died and went to heaven. Look who was there. Roger and Dan and Birdwhistle and Henry and Irving Goffman and Kenny and Dell and LeBeau and Schwed and Yoder. I mean, this was like a pantheon of either folklorists and others who were inspiring for the development of the field in the direction of, I would say, essentially a performance approach to what we think of as folklore. And so I was at the University of Pennsylvania from 1974 until the academic year 1980-81. It was a marvelous, marvelous experience, and to this day, so many of my students, and our students, actually collectively our students, you know, Steve Zeitlin and Shelley Posen, and just a whole array of them who have made their way subsequently and helped to shape the field. Now, New York at that time, many of us, there were many folklorists in New York City, but no folklore program. And all of us really yearned to see folklore established as a field in the academy. I mean, we were bitten by the bug. You know, we had seen what Dundas did, what Dorson did, what Kenny did in establishing the Department of Folklore and Folklife, and we said, how is it in New York City? There's nothing. We have to do something about this. Well, so what could we do? So what did we do? Basically, and this would have been in the 1970s, it was with Barbara Klein, Steve Zeitlin, Amanda Dargan, Shelley Posen, Maxine Miska, and many of them were in fact students from the University of Pennsylvania. What we did was we did ethnography of in the city of vernacular culture in a city that was on the verge of bankruptcy. So what did people do with vacant lots? Adam Purple created this incredible garden. And this was the heyday of subway graffiti. This is the period in which breakdancing emerges and rap emerges. And this was a time of casitas and community gardens. It was an extraordinary time. And it's out of this that in the mid-'80s that City Lore was formed as an organization. So basically, we never succeeded in establishing folklore as a field within the academy in New York, but we did succeed, and we did it by organizing a series of conferences that were high visibility in collaboration with Hunter College, with NYU, and in creating City Lore as a nonprofit organization dedicated to basically the folklore of New York City. And one of those conferences we organized it at NYU. And one of the reasons was that I had seen a flyer that was a flyer for something called performance theory. And on it was like Barbara Meyerhoff, Irving Goffman. I thought, my God, those are our people. Who is this guy? And this guy turned out to be Richard Shatner.
Yeah.
So I went to see him, and he had a little sort of apartment that he used as a study. He's sitting barefoot, cross-legged on the floor, and I talked with him, and he agreed that, okay, NYU would co-sponsor. And after that, maybe a year later, I got a phone call from him, and he said, and because he's a very direct guy, he said, how would you like to chair our department? I said, no, I'm not interested in chairing anything, number one. And number two, I don't want to chair a graduate department of drama. Because my mission was to create a folklore program somewhere. And also, I remember that when this offer was, so he said to me, how about lunch? I said, sure. So we had lunch, and I met the other colleagues, and they all got along extremely well. And what they told me is that there was a huge gap between what they were teaching, like Aeschylus to Ibsen, and what they were doing, Dionysus in '69. In other words, they were producing experimental, environmental, avant-garde performance off Broadway, not just off Broadway, but off Broadway. And there was a huge gap between what they were teaching and what they were producing as artists. And Richard had just had a long spell in India, and he was working on the Ramlila. Brooks McNamara was working on vaudeville and basically American popular performance. And so this performance theory seminar was, in a sense, the beginnings of performance studies as a field, and it was coming very much from theater. And what Richard said was, we want to make this into a performance studies department. I said, but why would you want a folklorist? And they said, because if we hire somebody from theater, we might backslide. For sure, we won't. So I called up Alan Dundas, because he's my mentor, and I said, what should I do? And basically, the idea was that I would be kind of like a Trojan horse. I'd come in looking like performance studies, but inside would be folklore. And I would be trying to actually establish a folklore program, and my dean was so patient. When he'd be talking to me about performance studies, I'd be talking to him about a folklore program. And so basically, that was my task. And I was convinced they'd hired the wrong person, that it would take them about 2 years to figure it out, it would be too late. And my first course that I developed was the aesthetics of everyday life. I was convinced that no one would take it because even the curriculum committee didn't understand it. I had to go and defend this syllabus to the curriculum committee. And of course it had in it all the work that we had done on urban folklore in the city. So 40 students turned up, and who were they? Choreographers, dancers, actors, directors, who are doing an academic PhD. And they said, we know everything we want. Everything we need to know about theater, we know. We don't need a course in theater. And of course, if you know the work of, say, Trisha Brown, Lucinda Childs, these sort of minimalist dancers, you can understand that the idea of the aesthetics of everyday life is actually absolutely where they were creating. And so, basically, that was my task, was to help this department to become a real department of performance studies, and to work with this team, with these faculty, to establish performance studies as a field and institutionalized within the academy. Within the first 2 years that I was at NYU, I received an invitation from Ed Bruner, an anthropologist at the University of Illinois, and he invited me to join him for an academic year abroad. It actually was for an organization called the International Honors Program that had been set up by Margaret Mead, who believed that if you were to take undergraduates around the world and have homestays and spend 4 to 6 weeks in each location, so this is not, semester at sea, anything like that, that it would be an incredible learning experience, and so that's what we did. And Ed, at that point, had been working on tourism, and I had never thought of working on tourism. That just never occurred to me. But in the course of that year, of that academic year, with Ed and with these American undergraduates, that was really where tourism, heritage, museums, that topic, as a topic I wanted to work on, really came together. And so it was some years later, but 1988, on the 100th anniversary of the American Folklore Society, that I published an essay, Mistaken Dichotomies. And this is, in a way, a kind of, I would say, sort of putting a stake in the ground at a moment when academic folklore could not absorb the number of PhDs that we were producing. The universities just didn't have enough positions. And we at the American Folklore Society felt that we had a moral obligation to find employment for the people that we had trained. And so the development of public sector folklore, as it was called, or public folklore as it was called, really started to take root. And with the creating of state folklorist positions and nonprofit folk arts organizations. And Dorson hated this idea. Dan Venimos hated this idea. And why? And why? So from Dorson's point of view, basically, first of all, he had a bone to pick with Ben Bodkin. That was his favorite enemy. Because he said, all those popularizers, they bolderize folklore, they produce fake lore. I'll tell you about the real Paul Bunyan folklore, not that bolderized stuff. And that somehow it will diminish the standing of the field because he was completely committed, although he was a popularizer himself.
That's right.
Dan Venimos, to this day, he's against the public sector. He feels that basically that there are two risks with public sector folklore. One is that it compromises the authenticity of the lore, and secondly, it compromises the integrity of the discipline. That's basically their problem. And so, and so it was fake lore. You thought fake news was a new term. We had fake lore long before that. Folklorismus, Wilma's Voigt, Hungary. Applied folklore, David Hufford, which is actually something else altogether. So it just, I kind of got annoyed about this, and I felt that this kind of opposition was, number one, doing an injustice to the very, very good work that public folklorists were doing, number one, and number two, that there was something theoretically here amiss because of, if you will, advocacy blinding those who were opposed to it from some very sort of, I think, deep aspects of the field that were and are from the outset putting in question the distinction between pure and applied folklore. So the essay Mistaken Dichotomies was an attempt to really show how that dichotomy obscures the ideological, political, economic bases of folklore as it's studied in the academy and practiced in the public sphere, and to try to initiate a kind of critical discourse that would be independent of advocacy or the opposite, that is to say, of critique. But probably as important for me was a conference at the Smithsonian, also in 1988, that produced the volume Exhibiting Cultures. And I had prepared a paper for it, but then Svetlana Alpers gave a paper, and I got really annoyed. Really, I got furious, actually. So I sat there and listened, and she's a great scholar and a wonderful person, so nothing personal. But she insisted that the only things worth exhibiting are things that are of, quote, visual interest. And I thought to myself, no way. So I put my paper away, I took notes, And then I actually spoke from those notes, and it became an essay in the volume called Objects of Ethnography. And that was, in a sense, a staking out for myself of a whole kind of trajectory of trying to think critically about museums and what they do, whether it's the museum effect, whatever it is that they do. And so this was a period when, by 2003, but there are many years leading up to it, we get the Intangible Heritage Convention, and my thinking that is really starting from the mistaken dichotomies and starting from objects of ethnography is very I feel kind of prepared to try to engage with this issue of intangible cultural heritage, where I think folklorists were the absolutely best positioned of any field. And in fact, the Smithsonian and the Folklife Center played a critical role in dealing with this convention. And when you read the definition for the purposes of the convention, you can see that it is a kind of a version of a definition of folklore, but of course it's for the purposes of the convention itself. Now, in thinking about the convention, this is where I basically started to try to think theoretically about heritage, because there was something deeply troubling about the convention and about its intended and unintended consequences. And so this became for me quite a productive idea, that heritage is a mode of metacultural production that produces something new, which, though it has recourse to the past, is fundamentally different from it. In other words, that this mode of cultural production gives the endangered or outmoded a second life as an exhibition of itself. And what that did was to give me a kind of way of looking at what was going on with ethnographic museums. Today we talk about decolonizing the museum. We didn't really have that language in the late 80s, although I think we had the spirit, but not the language. And one of the things that struck me about ethnographic museums was some of the transformations they were going through as they were addressing their own, if you will, past imperfect, their own imperfect past. And that is the idea that particularly ethnographic museums were once the home for fields that produced and required collections. But as the knowledge formations, such as folklore and ethnology, moved into the university, leaving their collections behind, the museum became custodian of the collections of outmoded scientific disciplines. And in reinventing themselves, these ethnographic museums have become agents of heritage. So this kind of was a way in which these topics started to come together for me. So I want to end with the sort of two projects, and I think many of you are already familiar with them, but they help to somehow or other round out this choreography of a career. So I started interviewing my father in 1967, and I interviewed him for more than 40 years, and of course I recorded the interviews until the day he died. And I would say that he got sick when he was 59, and he was worried that if he got sick again, and he thought he might, that my mother would be stuck with the business. So he sold the business, and then he got better. And he was retired. He was a very young retired person, and he was at his wit's end. And for 10 years, he kind of, there was like some depression and various and sundry things that he did, but nothing really worked. And for that over those 10 years, because I knew him so well, I basically, I said to him, you should paint what you remember. And then my mother chimed in, and then my husband chimed in. And and some of you met my father because I brought him to AFS and he presented. I think some of you may recall. And so, every Father's Day, every anniversary, every birthday, we gave him paint and canvas and Conti crayon and paper and everything imaginable. It was just piled up in a closet. Until one day my mother came home and said to him, I went to the local Jewish community center and I signed you up for art classes, and they don't give refunds. That was it. That was it. So he went to the life drawing class, and that got once. That was enough, because it was a nude model, which he thought would be okay. But the instructor asked the model to keep on moving because he wanted to just capture the movement, whatever. He couldn't handle it. He went to the still life class, And it was a box with a piece of cloth with an onion and a green pepper. He calls it his green pepper period. And it was just deadly. And I could see on one of the pages, on one of the sheets of paper, that the teacher had made a kind of a sketch to show him how to draw. And I thought, I think I've seen that before. At the art supply store, you know how they have one of those racks, and then they have those books? It's how to draw in 10 easy lessons. And I thought, no way. So we said to him, listen, just, bite the bullet, just paint what you remember. And then my mother said to him, paint the kitchen. Do it for Barbara. She'll use it in her work. Because she knew that, and he knew also that it was of all the things he ever described, it was my favorite. And so he began. And he was 73 when he started, and he painted for the last 20 years of his life. And so he would tell me where everything was. It's on the corner of this, it's the end of that street, and I was completely confounded. So I went ahead and I made a list of all the places he told me, and I said to him, put it on a map, and he drew me a map. And because when I would interview him, and he would be explaining to me, because he had an incredible memory and he was fascinated, he was like a living popular mechanics, because he was just fascinated by how things worked. He would always make me a little drawing. I mean, here is a drawing showing me how the pump worked for water to put out a fire. Not as, not like I'm going to put out a fire with a pump, or have to make one, but he wanted me to understand it, and that's what he did. And then, of course, he began with the kitchen, and then the courtyard, and then, if you remember the marketplace from the very beginning of my talk, this is how he remembered the marketplace on market day, and how he remembered the interior of the synagogue, which was actually survived the war and then was destroyed after the war, and the materials were repurposed and recycled for other buildings. And I said to him, you came over on this boat, and you remember coming past Newfoundland to Halifax through the ice flows, and he told me many stories, so he also communicated the voyage to Toronto. And then I said to him, you did not live through the Holocaust, but right after the war, your father received letters that described in detail what had happened to his family. And also, when survivors came back, they also described what had happened. And you told me about it in very, very visual way. Pardon me. So why don't you paint? Why don't you paint? Because he had painted stories that were not from his memory, but from stories that appeared in the memorial book for his town. So it was that he could visualize a story and actually create a painting. So I thought, well, why not the Holocaust? And so he did. In the case of his mother's family, there were 6,500 Jews in a town of 10,000, and it was quite typical. And in 2 days, 3 weeks after I was born on September 30th, 1942, and approximately October 20th, 21st, 1942, 6,000 of the 6,500 Jews were sent to the death camp in Treblinka, and 500 were marched to Sandomierz. And his grandmother, who was older, and he described her as 5 by 5, couldn't keep up, and so she was shot along the road. In the case of his father's family lived in a town called Ilja, and it was a much smaller town. And what happened in his father's family is that during the spring and summer and fall, his father's brothers would go out and into the forest and join the partisans. But when winter came and snow, they couldn't stay in the forest. They would come back into the ghetto, because there was a ghetto in Apatov, my father's town, and also in Ilja. And somebody snitched on them, and when the Germans found out, they basically gathered together all of my father's mother's children, her sons and daughters, their wives, their children, lined them up, tied her to a tree, and shot them all, and then shot her. And so and actually this is a fascinating painting, because he didn't know how he would paint this scene until we were in Madrid at the Prado, and Max, my husband, took him upstairs to Goya's Disasters of War, which is an extraordinary painting, and my father said immediately he knew exactly how to do this painting. But what's very exceptional about the project is that we went back to his hometown, and the town embraced him and insisted on exhibiting his work in the county seat. And there's a whole story about the repercussions of that embrace, which I think is quite astonishing. Finally, in the last, I would say since 2002, the culminating project of my entire life, my entire career, is in fact POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And this museum has been created on the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. Basically, after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April and May of 1943, the Germans simply razed the ghetto, which had been the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. And in 5 years after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, on the 5th anniversary in 1948, the monument of the ghetto heroes was unveiled on the rubble of the ghetto. And you can see the destroyed city of Warsaw in the background because a year after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Uprising and destroyed 85% of the historical core of Warsaw. Now, I had heard in 2002 that they're creating a museum, a Jewish history museum in Warsaw, but I never heard anything else. So I just assumed there was maybe somebody who had some idea, maybe it's going to be, on the second floor of a high school. I had no idea what it was. But the then director, Jerzy Halberstadt, came to New York, called me and said he's coming to New York, he'd like to show me the project. And he did, and I was really impressed. And then a while later, he asked me to come to Warsaw and review the work they had been doing on it, because the project had begun as an idea in 1993. And by the time I became involved, they'd already developed a master plan for the exhibition. Once the museum was founded in 2005, Jerzy called me and asked me if I would lead the development of the core exhibition, of the multimedia narrative exhibition. And I stopped for a moment to think about it, and then I said yes. And I said yes for two reasons. I said yes because I believed that this would be such an important project, that it was so urgent that I wanted to bring everything I had ever done and ever thought and ever knew how to do. I wanted to bring it to this project. I felt that this project had to be the absolute best it could be, and I wanted to give it absolutely the best I could give it. And it was coming to me at a point in my career where I could do whatever I wanted. I didn't have to worry about tenure. I didn't have to worry about, really about anything. I could do whatever I wanted. So that was the first reason. But there was a second reason, and the second reason was because I wanted to think new thoughts about museums. And it seemed to me that the best way to think new thoughts about museums was to make one. And especially to make one that was not intuitively the kind of exhibition that I would normally gravitate towards, which was a multimedia narrative exhibition. I had not seen any that I thought were very good. And so I was a little bit, I would say, not skeptical, but I wasn't completely with the program, but I thought that's actually a good reason to do it. That if I'm uncomfortable with it, it means there's something going on there, I should do it. And so this museum basically opened its doors in 2013. It had its grand opening in 2014, and it completes the memorial complex. Basically, we go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died, and we come to the museum, which presents the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, to honor their memory by remembering how they lived, and how they lived for 1,000 years. In order to really do what had to be done, I moved to Poland and lived there full-time for 10 years, and I became a Polish citizen.
Wow.
And what I didn't realize is how much this meant to the team that I was working with. The day that I got the paper that was stamped that said I was a Polish citizen, even before I had the passport, I came back to the office, and there they were. They had made a cake, and they had printed the ID that you get, that is, I don't know what you call it, like a driver's license, only it's the substitute for the passport, so you don't have to carry your passport around, with 3 sparklers, flowers, a gift. It was essentially a children's book for my rudimentary Polish, and my oldest and dearest friend from the 70s, made a speech, and what it meant to my Polish team, I just had no idea how much it meant to them, and it meant the world to me as well. And I think my father also, understood what I was doing. And so the exhibition itself, I think of as a theater of history. And if there were ever a performance approach to museums, because at NYU I taught a course called Tourist Productions, Museum Theater, Food and Performance, Aesthetics of Everyday Life. If there were ever a performance approach to the museum, and when I say museum theater, I don't mean proscenium theater. I mean it in a broader sense, and it's another longer conversation. This was it, and I think it's really the making of this museum. But I think that what is of particular interest, and I really encourage you to come tomorrow evening at 7, because this documentary film is a film about, I would say, the relationship between tangible and intangible heritage as we enacted it in the creating of the painted ceiling and timber-framed roof. And I say created, not reconstructed, not copied, not facsimile, not any of those terms that privilege something that was so-called original and then something that's not original. It's a documentary film about the process. And just sort of very, very briefly, there were wonderful wooden synagogues, particularly created in the 17th and 18th century, across the length and breadth of the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And about 200 of them have been identified. Many of them were documented, especially at the end of the 19th century, when there was a kind of an interest in vernacular wooden architecture. All of them were destroyed by whatever was left standing was destroyed by the Germans during World War II, and there's not one left, not a single one. The single best documented one was in Gwoździec, which is today in Ukraine. And we worked with a non-profit educational studio in Massachusetts called Hans House Studio. And their motto is to recover lost objects. And what they say is you can never recover the original object in the sense of the original material, but you can recover the knowledge of how to make it by making it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. In other words, they were privileging the intangible heritage of embodied knowledge over original material. And so we partnered with the American Timber Framers Guild. These guys are lunatics. They will bring their adzes and their pit saws and their axes, and they will timber frame anywhere they have an opportunity. And they brought them on the plane. They're like Lord of the Rings. And so we formed a team of about 300 experts as well as students, some of whom had never ever picked up a tool of this kind. And we did the timber framing actually at an open air, Skansen, an open air folk architecture museum in the south of Poland, outside of Sanok. And we conducted a whole set of painting workshops in existing, still standing masonry synagogues across the length and breadth of Poland. And then we assembled it, and this is what we have in the museum today. Now, what I most love about this project is that in order to recover the knowledge of how to build it, you had to build it, and once you build it, you actually materialized that knowledge. And so that kind of relationship between intangible and tangible in this particular project is it just gives you so much to think about. And it's very Japanese, because in fact there are wooden temples in Japan that are, quote, 800 years old and never more than 20 years old, because they tear them down in order to have to rebuild them, because it's the only way to transmit the knowledge of how to build them. And they value that knowledge more than they value the original material. So it's just, a brilliant, and it's just given me so much to think about. And then finally, we think of the museum as playing a very important role in the renewal of Jewish life in Poland. And one of my favorite objects from the post-war period, probably from the 80s, was from one of our scholars who worked with us, Staszek Krajewski. And he actually ran a hotline from his home. The poster on the left basically says, "Do you have Jewish roots? Is it your problem? A secret? Maybe your passion, your pride, your hope? Regarding these problems, you do not need to stand alone. If you'd like to talk about your Jewishness, call this number on Thursdays between 5:30 and 8:30 p.m. And that gives you like a little bit of a sense. And so in that spirit, we end this exhibition with interviews with about 20 individuals, essentially Jews who were born, raised in Poland, and we asked them a range of questions. But the single most surprising question that we posed, at least surprising to me, obviously not to my colleagues, was the question, did you always know you were Jewish? Which is a question I would never have thought to ask here in the United States or in Canada. And it's the reason why when everybody, I mean virtually everybody asks how many Jews there are in Poland, the chief rabbi says, I don't know how many Jews there are, I just know that the number increases and the birth rate doesn't go up. So that tells you a little bit about that. And so essentially, I have the feeling that with the opportunity, this extraordinary opportunity to lead the development of the core exhibition at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews, that I was able to draw and close a very, very big and very, very long circle. Thank you.
Everybody, we have some time for a couple of questions before we go over across the street to the reception. Who would like to ask a
And
question?
comments, objections, I'm
Who will be bravest? Who will be first? Done.
Yeah, I'm curious if the museum or any component of it there is actually a place of worship or has a spirit, well, spiritual is not quite right, but is some, I'm aware of museum settings which have an exhibit, an exhibit component to them, but also for some part of the population, they're a place of spiritual pilgrimage or something like that.
It's actually, it's really interesting because we've had requests to hold a circumcision in the synagogue, a request to hold a bar mitzvah in the synagogue, and it's not, it's not a consecrated space. It doesn't have a Torah, it doesn't have a Torah scroll, for example. So in that way, it's it's not a synagogue. It really is, and the beauty of it also is that it floats. There are no walls, there are no pillars, it's actually suspended from cables. I think that even though it doesn't function as a synagogue, I do think that people have a very special experience there, and that they usually stop in their tracks and they're just kind of overcome. So whether one wants to call it a religious experience, a spiritual experience, it is an experience, but it's not linked to any ritual act or behavior, not at all. But there, on the other hand, when we had the grand opening with the core exhibition, I managed, it took some effort to get my favorite cantor to stand on that reader's platform in the middle and actually perform. And I don't remember now what he performed. I have to really go back and look, but probably I would expect it would be a kind of a blessing on something new, because there are such blessings. So we've done things that are kind of like para somehow, but there is something about it that does evoke a very special feeling, and it isn't just like looking at a work of art. Well, just looking at a work of art. That's not exactly fair to a work of art, but if you know what I mean. But I think it's a very interesting observation.
Bill.
I've always thought there was a lot of boldness in your career.
A lot of?
Boldness, with a B, B-O-L-D. And I just wonder if you would comment on the role of drive and ambition in converting your training, your knowledge into a dynamic career.
I think, I like to think that because I really fought against this dichotomy between academic and public, that I benefited from being able to operate in both spheres. Specifically, I looked at, for example, the work that I did on this museum, but also on other projects, as a way of thinking new thoughts, as a way of generating new theoretical insights. And for example, that wooden synagogue project, I don't think I would have ever been thinking in those terms if I had not been involved in that project. So I would say this, that it was that practice informed theory and theory informed practice, and that was a very, very rich. I'll tell you somebody else who does it. It's Robert Barron. He's doing the same thing. You know, he does his job at the New York State Arts Council, and at the same time he's thinking critically, and he's involved in policy and thinking critically and theoretically about heritage. So it's that. It's the convergence of the two. They're not compartmentalized. They're not parallel tracks. They're working together. Now, sometimes my work is primarily in the academy. Sometimes it's primarily in the museum context. But in fact, the thinking and the writing is actually at the convergence of them. And I think that has been enormously rewarding, enormously productive. The other thing is that I worked with a wonderful international team of academics that we involved all the way through the process. And because I'm an academic, I could command their respect. And that was important because I hadn't spent my entire life working in a museum outside of the academy. But at the same time, because I had also been working in museum settings and working on exhibitions, I was able to actually hold the designers' feet to the fire to insist and demand that we get the best from them. So it just was a kind of a way of deploying these various, I would say, experiences, skills, training, ways of working. I mean, that would be how I'd express it.
Please.
What advice do you have for undergraduate folklore students?
Well, graduate school. Yeah, I'll put it this way, because I think that it depends on what you want to do, obviously. It depends, because there are lots of things one can do, even as I know, without a high school diploma. So it's not as if it's only with graduate, but if you want to compete, you're competing with people who do have postgraduate degrees. That's, I mean, to put it quite apart from the intrinsic value of the study, the intrinsic value and also the practical value of what you do learn, the skills you develop, the depth of thinking, the sort of depth of knowledge that comes with the ability to write well. I think that it depends on what you want to do, first and foremost. But I think that postgraduate study is a really good idea, and the question is, what should it be? Should it be museum studies? Should it be folklore? Should it be an area studies? Should it be in some, that would be the question, really, would be where to go with it.
Question here up front.
I've been wanting to ask this question to you for 3.5 years. So I got to go to the museum in 2016, summer of 2016. We've been having discussions on campus about the creation of the museum, and Dariusz has been here, I think, twice now. When I went into the museum, I was just overwhelmed all the time, and all of my senses were going off. And there was so much visual, there was text, there were textures, there was everything going on in every single room, all around, sounds piped in, big cascading, everything, motion and colors and everything. And I was wondering if that ever came in as you were designing things to say, what is too much, to where someone gets so overwhelmed by the experience. When I go to the Art Institute in Chicago, you can go and look at a painting for a while and then leave, or go and stare at a white wall. And in this museum, there are almost no white walls. I was wondering how you struck that balance.
In a way, you're talking to the wrong person, because my motto is from William Blake. The path of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. This is my motto, or nothing exceeds like excess. So I am by nature a maximalist, I have to confess. And but to take your point seriously, I would say that the visitors have really, really different responses, and a lot has to do with expectations. The intention is to provide a very immersive experience, one where you really forget about everything else, and you're just completely inside the experience, inside the story, and it's one of the reasons why we only use sources from the period. It's one of the reasons why we drive the narrative with primary sources. So we have a whole range of strategies for trying to, in a sense, create an experience that is to create an immersive experience where the mode of attention is absorption. Now, if you come to it with a different expectation, which is a much more analytical, cognitive way of proceeding, you'll have trouble. I mean, because you can't read everything, you can't do everything.
Right.
So whereas in some other, particularly temporary exhibitions, where the expectation is an hour and a half, you know, you can make your way through it, there's a couple of text panels, you've got a few objects, and you can make your way through. Here, it's not about seeing everything, doing everything, and reading everything.
Right.
It is much more about experience and about letting go, and not, and it's also, I would say, it's about absorption. Absorption. Now, absorption is very different from a more cognitive, intellectual, although there's that also, of course. But there are a lot of places to sit.
Let me ask for one more question before the caterer and the bartender wonder where we are. Go ahead.
Me?
In the arc of your life, what role do you think your dumpster diving experiences in Bloomington affected this dichotomy between the theoretical and the practical?
Thank you for working that in, by the way.
Whoa. Well, let me put it this way.
Can you repeat the question?
So, what I would say is this. We were poor. I mean, really, really poor. You know, I think that Dorson took whatever meager financial aid he had, and he chopped it up into as many small pieces as he could.
Yeah.
Honestly, it wasn't enough for anybody. And it's, you know, should we all starve or only some of us? So we were really, really poor, and I had a small subsidy from the Canadian government and a loan. And so we had to be really resourceful, and I don't think I can go there.
Well, grad students, you do have an hour and a half with her tomorrow if you want to bring that up
Yeah,
again.
actually tomorrow, you know, when we're sitting down and maybe over a glass of wine, I think it's a for more intimate conversation.
So there are other opportunities to have a chance to talk to Barbara. I'd invite you to cross the street to break bread. Let's all thank her once again for her.